The rancher bought a rusty mill for $1. His dog was about to discover what it was really worth. Royce Barrett handed over the crumpled bill, and Virgil Granger took it with a smile that didn't touch his eyes. The deal was done. A 30-year-old ruin sold for the price of a cheap drink. Granger signed the deed without a second glance and walked away, his steps too quick, too eager, like a man escaping a fire. Royce stood there, the flimsy paper in his hand, and watched him go. A cold knot tightened in his gut. Why would a man like Virgil Granger, who owned half the territory, sell anything for $1? It didn't make sense. The numbers didn't add up. The mill itself was a skeleton. Its walls sagged like the ribs of a starved horse. Rust bled from every nail and hinge, a deep orange sickness. The great water wheel was frozen solid, locked in the mud of a stream that had mostly dried up years ago. Anyone else would see a pile of garbage waiting to be torn down. Royce saw a lifeline. He saw scrap metal, iron and steel he could haul into town and sell. Maybe a few $100s worth if he was lucky. Enough to get him and his dog, Ash, through the coming winter. It was simple math. $1 in, a few hundred out. A good deal for a man with nothing left but the dirt under his boots. But the moment he stepped inside, the math went sideways. Ash, who would charge a grizzly with his tail wagging, froze dead in the doorway. His ears went flat. Every muscle in his body went tight as a bowstring. Royce had never seen the dog act like this. Not with coyotes, not with strangers, not with anything that belonged in the natural world. The air inside was thick. It tasted of old metal and damp earth, like a graveyard full of buried coins. And the shadows. The shadows clung to the corners in ways they shouldn't. The light from the open door didn't seem to reach them. Royce ran a hand along a wooden support beam and felt a strange vibration, a low hum that ran up his arm and settled in his bones. The building felt like it was breathing. Ash pressed against his leg, a low whine caught in his throat. It was the sound of pure primal fear. That night, Royce couldn't sleep. He kept seeing Granger's quick exit. He kept feeling that strange hum. He kept thinking that his $1 hadn't bought a building. It had bought a secret. The next morning, he went back with a crowbar and a lantern, telling himself he was just there for the scrap. But Ash wouldn't go inside. The dog stood at the threshold, a deep growl rumbling in his chest, his eyes fixed on the darkness within. And that's when Royce knew. The mill hadn't been abandoned. It had been waiting. 3 weeks earlier, Royce had sat on the edge of his bed and counted the coins in an old tobacco tin. $43 and change. That was all that stood between him and starvation. His ranch was failing. The land was dry, the cattle were thin, and the barn leaned so far to the west it looked like a strong wind could knock it over. Most nights, his dog ate better than he did, and Royce was determined to keep it that way. He was standing outside the general store when he heard 2 old-timers talking. One of them mentioned that Virgil Granger was looking to get rid of the old mill. The other one just laughed. Said no one would take that wreck unless Granger paid them to haul it away. But Royce heard something else. He heard the clink of scrap metal. He heard a way to survive. He found Granger that evening on the edge of town, loading fine-looking crates onto a wagon. Granger was a man who wore his wealth like a second skin. His clothes were clean, his silver hair was neat, and his eyes never stayed in one place for too long. Royce always distrusted a man who couldn't look you in the eye. When Royce asked about the mill, Granger went still, just for a second. Then a smooth, unreadable mask slipped over his face. "You want to buy it?" he asked. "Depends on the price," Royce said. $1. Royce just stared. He must have misheard. Even a worthless piece of land had some value. $1, Granger repeated, his voice flat. "Take it or leave it." He already had the deed out. He already had a pen in his hand. "I just want it gone," Granger added, almost to himself. "Off my conscience." That one word, conscience, snagged in Royce's mind. But a desperate man can't afford to ask too many questions. He signed the paper. He handed over the dollar he'd been saving for a sack of flour. And Granger walked away without another word, without a single look back. Royce stood there under the setting sun, holding a deed to a building he'd never seen, and wondered what kind of sin a man had to commit to sell a piece of his soul for $1. The next day, Royce walked to the mill, Ash trotting at his side. The morning sun made the place look even worse. The wood was the color of old bones, and the rust seemed to have eaten right through the metal. He walked around the building twice, looking for the catch. The foundation seemed solid, too solid for a building this old. It should have sunk into the ground, but it stood firm, as if refusing to be buried. Ash stopped dead at the doorway, just like before. He wouldn't budge. "It's just a building, boy," Royce said, trying to convince himself as much as the dog. He stepped inside and the world changed. The air got heavy, like he was breathing through a wet cloth. And that metallic smell was stronger now, sharp and biting, like the air after a lightning strike. He lit his lantern, and the flickering light threw monstrous shadows against the walls. The walls were covered in dark stains that looked eerily like handprints, hundreds of them, overlapping, as if countless people had pressed their palms against the wood in a desperate attempt to get out. He walked deeper into the gloom. His boots on the floorboards made a strange sound, not a solid thud, but a hollow echo. He knelt down and knocked. Hollow. Definitely hollow. He stood up, his heart starting to beat a little faster. He walked to the far wall and knocked again. The same empty sound. He put his shoulder against the wall and pushed. The wood flexed. It bent inward, soft and pliable. Old wood shouldn't do that. Old wood should crack and splinter. He jammed the end of his crowbar into a seam between two boards and pried. The wood groaned, resisted, and then snapped with a sound like a rifle shot. Ash barked outside, a sharp, frantic warning. Royce froze, the lantern shaking in his hand. Behind the broken boards, there was no wall. There was just darkness, a deep, unnatural blackness where there should have been solid studs and insulation, a space that had no right to be there. And from the depths of that impossible darkness, he heard it again. Not a hum this time. Not a vibration. It was the slow, steady, unmistakable sound of something breathing. Royce's blood ran cold. He held the lantern higher, trying to peer into the void behind the wall. The breathing was slow, rhythmic, like a large animal sleeping. But there was no animal in this territory that sounded like that. He thought about turning around, about walking away and never coming back. Forget the scrap metal, forget the money. Some things were better left buried. But he couldn't. That word Granger had used, conscience, kept echoing in his mind. He had to know what was in there. He widened the hole with his crowbar, pulling away splintered boards until the opening was big enough to squeeze through. Ash was going crazy outside, barking and scratching at the door, but Royce tuned him out. He took a deep breath, held the lantern out in front of him, and crawled into the darkness. The space was narrow, a tight passage that ran the length of the wall. The air was stale and cold, and the breathing sound was louder in here. It seemed to be coming from below him. He swept the lantern light across the floor and saw it. A trap door. A simple wooden square with a rusty iron ring for a handle. It was so covered in dust and grime that he almost missed it. He knelt, his knees protesting on the rough wood. He grabbed the iron ring with both hands and pulled. It was heavy, sealed shut with age and damp. He braced his feet and pulled again, grunting with the effort. With a deep groan, the trapdoor lifted, revealing a set of steep stone steps leading down into absolute blackness. And the breathing sound rushed up to meet him, a cold, foul wind that smelled of rot and damp earth. He hesitated for only a moment. Then, lantern in hand, he started down the steps. Each step took him deeper into the cold, deeper into the darkness. The air grew thicker, heavier. The breathing sound was all around him now, a constant, menacing presence. At the bottom of the stairs, he found himself in a small, stone-lined cellar. and in the center of the cellar, on a dusty wooden crate, was an old, leather-bound ledger. It was the source of the sound. Royce stared, completely baffled. The book was just sitting there. He cautiously approached it. The breathing wasn't coming from the book itself, but from underneath it. He reached out a trembling hand and lifted the ledger. Beneath it was a small, intricate clockwork device, a series of gears and bellows that expanded and contracted, perfectly mimicking the sound of a living creature. It was a clever trick. A scarecrow made of sound, designed to keep people away. But why? What was so important that it needed to be guarded by a ghost? He opened the ledger. The pages were filled with names, dates, and figures. It wasn't a business ledger. It was a record of debts. Dozens of names, families he recognized from the area, all listed next to sums of money and property deeds. And at the bottom of every page, the same signature: Virgil Granger. He flipped through the pages, his sense of dread growing with each one. He saw the name of his own grandfather, Silas Barrett. Next to his name was the deed to their family ranch, the one Royce was now struggling to keep. The sale price was listed as $10. $10 for 100 acres of prime grazing land. It was theft. All of it. Granger hadn't built his empire. He had stolen it, piece by piece, from his desperate neighbors. And then he saw something else. Tucked into the back of the ledger was a folded map. It was a map of the territory, but it was marked with strange symbols over certain properties. His family's ranch had one. The old Johnson place had one. So did a dozen others. At the bottom of the map was a key. The symbol meant vein, gold. Granger hadn't just been stealing land. He'd been stealing fortunes. Royce felt a wave of nausea. This was the secret of the mill. This was the weight on Granger's conscience. He had bled this territory dry for decades, and he had hidden the proof right here, under a fake ghost and a dollar deal. A floorboard creaked above him. Royce froze. He snuffed out the lantern, plunging the cellar into total blackness. He held his breath, straining to hear. Footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps moving across the mill floor directly above his head. He wasn't alone anymore. He clutched the heavy ledger to his chest, his mind racing. There was only one way out, and someone was standing right on top of it. He could hear them moving around, the scrape of a boot, a low cough. Then he heard a familiar voice. "Barrett? I know you're in here. I can smell your cheap lantern oil." It was Granger. Royce's heart hammered against his ribs. How did he know? Had he been followed? Or had Granger never really intended to let him keep the mill? The dollar wasn't a sale. It was bait. Granger had used him to retrieve the ledger, and now he was here to tie up the loose end. "I'll double your money, Barrett," Granger called down, his voice echoing in the small space. $2. Just slide that book up here and we can both walk away." Royce stayed silent, pressing himself against the cold stone wall. The clockwork mechanism on the crate continued its steady, rhythmic breathing, a ghostly heartbeat in the dark. "Don't be a fool!" Granger's voice was sharper now, laced with impatience. "That box is full of ancient history. It means nothing to you, but it means a great deal to me. I will not let a dirt-poor rancher with a stray dog undo 30 years of my work." A new sound, the distinctive click of a revolver's hammer being cocked. "Last chance, Barrett. Come out, or I come in." Royce knew he was trapped. Granger was standing on the only exit. But then he remembered something. The cellar wasn't just dirt and stone. The back wall felt different, damper. He ran his hands along the rough surface, and his fingers found a loose stone. He pulled. It came away easily, revealing not dirt, but more darkness. A tunnel. He could hear Granger starting to pry at the trapdoor above. He didn't have much time. He shoved the ledger and the map into the opening, then squeezed himself through, scraping his shoulders on the rough-hewn rock. The tunnel was narrow and smelled of damp earth and decay. He scrambled forward on his hands and knees, pulling the stone back into place behind him just as a shaft of lantern light pierced the cellar from above. He heard Granger curse, followed by the sound of his heavy boots coming down the stone steps. Royce scrambled faster, moving deeper into the suffocating blackness of the earth. He had no idea where the tunnel went, only that it led away from the man who was coming to kill him. He had the truth in his hands, a truth that could tear Virgil Granger's world apart. But first, he had to get out of the ground alive. The tunnel twisted and turned, and Royce crawled on, blind and desperate. The air was thin, and his lungs burned. He could hear Granger behind him, his footsteps echoing in the narrow passage. He was bigger than Royce, and the tight space was slowing him down, but he was still coming. Just when Royce thought he was going to suffocate, his outstretched hand hit not rock, but wood. Old, rotten wood. He pushed, and a section of the wall gave way, sending him tumbling out into a space filled with the smell of hay and manure. He was in a barn, not his barn. This one was well kept, the stalls clean, the air thick with the scent of healthy animals. He looked back at the hole he'd come through. It was hidden behind a stack of old feed sacks, an escape route. Granger had planned for everything. He scrambled to his feet, the heavy ledger clutched under his arm, and ran for the barn door. He burst out into the blinding afternoon sun and found himself standing in the middle of Virgil Granger's own ranch. The main house, a grand two-story affair, stood on a rise a few hundred yards away. He was in the belly of the beast. He heard a shout from the barn behind him. He didn't look back. He just ran. He vaulted a fence and sprinted across a pasture, startling a herd of fat, healthy cattle. He could hear men shouting now, and the sound of dogs barking. Not just one dog, but a pack. He glanced over his shoulder and saw them. 4 ranch hands on horseback, fanning out to cut him off. And leading them, on a big black stallion, was Virgil Granger. Royce ran for the tree line at the edge of the property, his lungs on fire. He was a good runner, but he was no match for horses on open ground. They were gaining on him, the thunder of their hooves getting closer with every second. He risked another look back. Granger was raising a rifle to his shoulder. A shot cracked through the air, and a puff of dust exploded just to Royce's left. They weren't trying to capture him. They were trying to kill him. He zigzagged, diving behind a small rise just as another bullet whizzed past his ear. He was pinned down. He had the evidence that could ruin the most powerful man in the territory, and he was going to die with it in a ditch a mile from the scene of the crime. Then he heard a different sound, a familiar, frantic barking. Over the crest of the hill, a black shape came bounding toward him. It was Ash. The dog must have followed his scent from the mill. Ash ran straight for the nearest horse, leaping and snapping at its legs. The horse reared, throwing its rider, and the other men reined in, momentarily confused. It was the chance Royce needed. He scrambled to his feet and made a break for the trees, Ash running at his heels. He plunged into the woods just as another volley of shots rang out, bullets tearing through the leaves around him. He kept running, deeper and deeper into the forest, not stopping until the sounds of pursuit had faded behind him. He finally collapsed at the base of an ancient oak tree, gasping for air, the heavy ledger digging into his ribs. Ash licked his face, whining with concern. "Good boy," Royce panted, stroking the dog's head. "You saved my life, you crazy mutt." He sat there for a long time, listening to the silence of the woods, his mind reeling. He had the proof. He had Granger's entire criminal enterprise documented in a dusty old book. But what good was it? Granger owned the town. He owned the sheriff. There was no one Royce could take it to. He was an outcast now, a man on the run with a price on his head. He had gone from being a broke rancher to being a hunted animal. He looked down at the ledger in his hands. This book had ruined 17 families. It had gotten his grandfather killed. And now, it was probably going to get him killed too. Unless he could find someone, anyone, who was brave enough to stand with him. He looked at the names on the pages. Many of the families were long gone. but some were still here. People who had been living under Granger's thumb for decades. People who were probably too scared to fight back. But maybe, just maybe, if they saw the proof, if they saw that they weren't alone, their fear would turn to anger. It was a long shot, a desperate, foolish gamble. But it was the only one he had. He had to get back to town. He had to show them the truth. And he had to do it before Granger and his men found him and buried that truth forever. Royce spent the night in the woods, cold and hungry, with Ash curled up at his side for warmth. At first light, he made his way cautiously toward town, sticking to the trees, his eyes scanning for any sign of Granger's men. The town was quiet when he arrived, the streets empty in the pale morning light. He knew he couldn't just walk into the sheriff's office. The lawman, a portly, lazy man named Sheriff Brody, was known to be in Granger's pocket. He needed an ally, someone the townspeople trusted. His mind went to Cora Lane, the elderly woman who ran the general store. Her name was in the ledger, too. She had signed as a witness on half a dozen of Granger's crooked deeds, including his grandfather's. She was either a part of it or a victim. He had to find out which. He slipped through the back alleys and came up behind the general store. He peeked through a grimy window and saw her inside, stacking cans on a shelf. She looked older than he remembered, her face a road map of worry. He tapped on the glass. She jumped, startled, and peered out at him. Recognition dawned in her eyes, followed quickly by fear. She shook her head and waved him away. Royce tapped again, more insistently this time, holding up the ledger so she could see it. Her eyes widened. She hesitated, glancing toward the front of the store, then unlocked the back door and let him in. "Are you insane?" she whispered, locking the door behind him. "Granger's men are turning this town upside down looking for you." "I know," Royce said, his voice low. "I found this in the old mill." He handed her the ledger. She took it with trembling hands and opened it. Her face went pale as she saw the familiar pages, the list of names, her own signature scrawled at the bottom. "I was young," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "He threatened my family. He said he'd burn us out if I didn't sign. We all signed. We were all scared." "I believe you," Royce said. "My grandfather's name is in here, too." "I remember Silas," she said, her voice thick with regret. "He was a good man. He fought Granger for as long as he could, but after the barn fire, he just gave up." So the fire hadn't been an accident. Royce felt a fresh wave of anger. "Granger has the sheriff in his pocket," Cora said, looking up at him, her eyes pleading. "You can't win this, Royce. He'll kill you and bury you somewhere no one will ever find. Take your dog and run. Get out of this territory while you still can." "And let him keep doing this?" Royce asked, his voice hard. "Let him keep stealing from people, threatening them, killing them? I can't do that. My grandfather couldn't fight him. But I can." "How?" she cried. "It's you against his entire empire." "Not just me," Royce said, tapping the ledger. "It's all of us. Everyone in this book. They just need to see it. They need to know they're not alone. Will you help me, Cora? Will you stand with me?" Cora looked at the ledger, at the names of her friends and neighbors, at the record of a crime that had haunted her for 30 years. He saw the fear in her eyes, but underneath it, he saw something else. A flicker of defiance, a spark of hope. "He'll come for me," she whispered. "He'll come for all of us if we do nothing," Royce countered. She was silent for a long time. The only sound in the store was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Finally, she took a deep breath and nodded. "What do you need me to do?" The plan was simple and reckless. They would gather the families. All the people whose names were in the ledger, who were still living in the territory. They would meet at the old abandoned church at dusk. There, Royce would show them the proof of Granger's crimes. Cora sent her young stockboy out with coded messages, telling people to come to the church for a special prayer meeting. It was a risk. If the boy was caught, or if anyone talked, Granger would know. But they had no choice. As dusk fell, Royce and Ash slipped out of the store and made their way to the church on the edge of town. It was a ruin, its roof long gone, its stone walls open to the sky. One by one, people began to arrive, their faces etched with suspicion and fear. There was Jonah Fletcher, a blacksmith whose father had lost his land. Elias Boone, a farmer who had been forced to sell his property for pennies on the dollar. Maria Santos, a widow whose husband had drowned in a shallow creek just a week after refusing one of Granger's offers. In all, a dozen people gathered in the crumbling church, their hushed whispers filling the twilight air. Royce stood before them, the ledger in his hands, and told them his story. He told them about the mill, the tunnel, and the book. Then, he opened it and began to read. He read the names. He read the dates. He read the pitiful sums of money that Granger had paid for their birthrights. A heavy silence fell over the group as they listened. The fear on their faces slowly began to curdle into a cold, hard anger. For the first time, they saw the full scope of Granger's crimes. They saw that their individual tragedies were all part of the same brutal pattern. "He has the law on his side," Jonah Fletcher said, his voice rough. "What can we do?" "The law in this town belongs to Granger," Royce said. "But there's a federal marshal 2 days' ride from here in Cottonwood Ridge. If we can get this ledger to him, Granger's reign is over." "Granger will never let us get there," Maria Santos said, her voice trembling. "He'll hunt us down." "He'll hunt me down anyway," Royce replied. "But he can't hunt all of us. If we ride together, we have a chance. We can see justice done. For our families, for my grandfather, for all of us." He looked around at their faces, at the years of pain and oppression etched into their skin. He saw their doubt. He saw their fear. But he also saw a glimmer of resolve. The truth had been spoken, and the truth, once loose, is a hard thing to put back in its cage. Before anyone could answer, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the road. Fast, too fast. "It's Granger!" someone hissed. "He knows!" Panic erupted. People started for the broken-down walls, looking for a place to run, a place to hide. "Hold your ground!" Royce shouted, his voice ringing out with an authority he didn't know he possessed. "We knew this was a risk. Running now will only get us picked off one by one. We stand together, or we fall apart." He pulled the old rifle from his shoulder as a group of riders appeared, their forms silhouetted against the dying light. There were at least 10 of them. And at their head, on his big black horse, was Virgil Granger. Sheriff Brody was right beside him. "Evening, folks," Granger said, his voice smooth as poison. "Sorry to interrupt your little prayer meeting. It seems one of you has something that belongs to me." His cold eyes settled on Royce. "Hand over the book, Barrett. There's no need for anyone to get hurt." Royce stood his ground, the heavy ledger tucked under one arm, the rifle held steady in the other. Ash stood beside him, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Behind him, the townspeople huddled together, their fear a palpable thing in the air. "It doesn't belong to you, Granger," Royce said, his voice clear and strong. "It belongs to them." Granger's smile faded. "Sheriff," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Arrest that man for theft." Sheriff Brody shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. He looked from Granger's cold, demanding face to the dozen angry, determined faces of his neighbors. He was a weak man, a corrupt man, but he wasn't a killer. "Now, Virgil," he started. "Maybe we can just talk this out." "Arrest him!" Granger roared, his mask of civility finally shattering. "Or I'll find a new sheriff who will." Brody licked his lips, his hand hovering over the pistol at his hip. He looked at Royce. He looked at the families. And then, to everyone's astonishment, he slowly shook his head. "No," Brody said, his voice barely a whisper. "These are my people, Virgil. I ain't drawing on them." Granger stared at him in disbelief, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of red. "You pathetic coward," he snarled. He turned to his own men. "Get the book. Kill anyone who gets in your way." His men drew their weapons and urged their horses forward. The townspeople cried out, shrinking back against the stone walls. This was it. This was where it ended. But then Jonah Fletcher, the blacksmith, stepped forward. He held nothing but a heavy hammer from his belt, but his face was set like iron. "You want it?" he bellowed. "You come through me!" Then Elias Boone stepped up beside him, holding a rusty pitchfork, and Maria Santos with nothing but a rock in her hand. One by one the people Royce had gathered stepped forward, forming a human wall in front of him. They were terrified. They were outmatched, but they were done running. Granger's men hesitated, looking to their boss for orders. They were paid thugs, not soldiers. They hadn't signed on for a massacre. Granger's face was a mask of pure fury. "Fire!" he screamed. A single shot rang out, not from Granger's men, but from the church doorway. One of the riders clutched his shoulder and fell from his horse. Cora Lane stood there, an old hunting rifle smoking in her hands. "The first man who moves is the next to die," she said, her voice shaking but clear. The standoff was absolute. For a long moment nobody moved. The only sound was the wind whistling through the ruined church. Granger looked at the defiant faces of the people he had terrorized for decades. He looked at his hesitant men. He looked at the smoking rifle in Cora's hands. And he knew he had lost, at least for tonight. "This isn't over, Barrett," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. He wheeled his horse around. "This town will burn for this!" He and his men galloped off into the darkness, leaving a cloud of dust and hatred behind them. A ragged cheer went up from the townspeople. They had faced down the devil and won. They crowded around Royce, clapping him on the back, shaking his hand. They had found their courage. But Royce knew Granger was right. This was far from over. They had won a battle, but the war for their homes, for their very lives, had just begun. They had to get the ledger to Cottonwood Ridge, and they had to leave now, before Granger came back with an army. If you've been on the edge of your seat with this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. They rode through the night, a small, determined convoy of farmers and shopkeepers turned fugitives. Royce led the way on a borrowed horse, with Ash loping tirelessly beside him. Cora drove her mule cart, the precious ledger wrapped in oilcloth and hidden beneath a pile of blankets. Jonah, Elias, and 3 other men rode as armed guards, their faces grim in the moonlight. They were a sorry-looking army, but they were bound by a common cause. The first day was tense, but uneventful. They pushed hard, stopping only to rest the horses, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. But by the morning of the second day, they knew they were being followed. They saw the dust cloud on the horizon first, a faint plume against the rising sun. It grew steadily larger, resolving into a group of at least 20 riders. Granger had kept his promise. He was coming with overwhelming force. "We can't outrun them," Jonah said, reining in his horse. "They'll be on us in an hour." "We have to split up," Royce said, his mind racing. "He wants the ledger. He wants me. The rest of you scatter. Head for the hills. He won't waste his time chasing all of you." "And what about you?" Cora asked, her old face tight with worry. "I'll lead them on a chase," Royce said. He took the satchel with the ledger from her cart. "It's me they want. I'll give them a run for their money." "It's suicide," Elias argued. "They'll corner you and kill you." "Maybe," Royce said, "but it's the only way the rest of you make it out of here. Get to Cottonwood Ridge. Tell the marshal what happened. Even without the book, your testimony will be enough to bring him back here." They argued, but they knew he was right. It was their only chance. With heavy hearts, they agreed. They wished him luck, their hands grasping his in a silent promise. Then they spurred their horses and scattered, fanning out in all directions, leaving Royce alone on the trail. He waited until they were gone, then turned his horse to face the approaching riders. He strapped the satchel to his back, patted Ash on the head, and whispered, "Let's go, boy." He kicked his horse into a gallop, not away from Granger, but parallel to his path, making sure they saw him. He saw the lead riders point in his direction. The entire posse changed course, a wave of dark horsemen thundering across the plains after him. The chase was on. He rode like a man possessed, pushing his horse to its limits. He was a better rider than any of Granger's hired guns, and he knew the terrain. He led them through narrow canyons and treacherous rock fields, places where their numbers were a disadvantage. Ash ran with him, a black streak against the red dirt, nipping at the heels of the lead horses, causing chaos and confusion. But they were relentless. For hours they pursued him, their bullets kicking up dust around him. His horse was tiring, its breath coming in ragged gasps. He knew he couldn't keep this up for much longer. He was heading for a place called Devil's Jaw, a deep, dead-end canyon. It was a trap, but it was also his last, desperate hope. He reached the entrance to the canyon just as his horse stumbled, its leg giving out. Royce jumped clear as the animal went down. He scrambled to his feet and ran into the narrow opening, Ash at his side, the satchel with the ledger bouncing on his back. The canyon walls rose up on either side of him, 100 feet of sheer rock. At the far end was a rock slide, a dead end. He was trapped. Granger and his men reined in at the canyon entrance, blocking his only escape. They dismounted slowly, rifles in hand, their faces triumphant. "Nowhere left to run, Barrett," Granger called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "It's over. Give me the book." Royce backed away until his back was against the cold stone of the rock slide. He unslung his rifle. He only had a few shots left. Ash stood beside him, hackles raised, teeth bared in a silent snarl. "You'll have to come and get it," Royce yelled back. Granger laughed, a cold, empty sound. "So be it." He raised his hand to give the order to fire. And in that moment, from the cliffs above, came a voice. "Drop your weapons, Granger. You're under arrest." Granger looked up, his face a picture of stunned confusion. Lining the rim of the canyon on both sides were armed men. Not his men. These men wore the badges of U.S. Marshals. And standing among them were Cora, Jonah, Elias, and the rest of the townspeople. They hadn't scattered. It had been a trick. They had circled around, taking a shortcut Royce had told them about, and had reached Cottonwood Ridge hours ago. They had brought the law back with them. Granger's men looked from the marshals above to their boss below. Their loyalty was to money, not to a losing cause. One by one, they dropped their guns. Granger stood alone, surrounded, his empire crumbling around him. His face was a twisted mask of rage and disbelief. He looked up at the marshals, then down at Royce. With a guttural scream of fury, he raised his rifle and fired. Not at the marshals, at Royce. Ash saw it coming. The dog launched himself at Royce, knocking him to the ground just as the bullet slammed into the rock where his head had been. The dog yelped, a sharp cry of pain, and collapsed. "Ash!" Royce cried out, scrambling to the dog's side. There was a dark, bloody patch spreading on the fur of his shoulder. Before Granger could fire again, a volley of shots rained down from the cliffs. Virgil Granger fell to the dust, his reign of terror finally, violently, over. Royce barely noticed. He was on his knees, his hands pressed against Ash's wound, trying to stop the bleeding. The dog whimpered, licking his hand weakly. Marshals and townspeople flooded into the canyon, but Royce saw only his dog, his loyal friend, who had saved his life one last time. "He's alive," Cora said, kneeling beside him. The bullet went clean through. He'll make it, Royce. He's a fighter. Weeks later, things in the territory were different. With the ledger as evidence, the federal government seized all of Granger's assets. The stolen land was returned to its rightful owners. The town had a new sheriff, an honest man appointed by the marshal. The fear that had choked the life out of the community for 30 years was finally gone. Royce's ranch was his again, free and clear. With the help of his neighbors, the barn was repaired, the fences were mended, and the land began to thrive once more. And limping at his side, a proud new scar on his shoulder, was Ash. Royce stood on his porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. He had started with nothing but $1 and a dog. He had faced down a tyrant and won back not just his home, but the soul of his town. He still had the tobacco tin with $43 in it. But now, he was the richest man he knew. If you enjoyed this story of justice in the Old West, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support is what allows us to keep bringing these tales of courage and redemption to you every single week. And if you have a story of your own where the underdog came out on top, we'd love to read about it in the comments below. Thank you for watching.